Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the SIL Legal Lounge podcast, Let's Talk Law, a show where we talk about different areas of law and policy in a frank and easy to understand manner so that everyone can end up learning something new. My name is Nida Tareen, and I am the principal of School of International Law, a recognized teaching center for the University of London LLB Honours International Programs. My guest for today is a dear friend of mine who I have known for a very long time, and she has dedicated her entire career to the advancement of human rights and especially the protection of women rights in Pakistan. We are joined by Maliha Zia, all the way from Karachi, who currently holds the position of Director, Gender, Law and Inclusion at the Legal Aid Society. Maliha was also one of the few people who were behind the implementation of the domestic violence bill, which was passed in Sindh and Balochistan in 2013. How are you, Maliha?
I am good, Nida. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank
Very
you for
excited.
taking out time. I just gave a very brief introduction. If you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So I have been a practicing lawyer in Pakistan, particularly in Islamabad and in Karachi. And I have been working with NGOs for a very, very long time and other nonprofit organizations working on women's legal rights. So looking at the legal empowerment approach of know the law, use the law, and shape the law with a specific focus on women, children, and religious minorities.
Very impressive. So, Malia, my first question for you today would be what first motivated you to begin working on women rights and gender based violence issues in Pakistan in particular? And I asked that because, recently on the 25th of November, that's the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So, why and how did you come about to, practicing or pursuing this passion of yours?
So mine is a very inspired story because my mother was one of the first members of the women's rights movement in Pakistan, which rose up in the 1970s, particularly with Ziaul Haq. And there were these number of women all across Pakistan when the arbitrary Hudud ordinances came in and they started seeing the violations that were regularly occurring through law against women and girls in particular. All of them rose. So the very first massive protest, was staged on 12th February in Lahore, which is now in fact Pakistan Women's Day, because when that one, the law of evidence was being passed, which was very discriminatory against women. And the one clause that still has survived is that the testimony of women has been reduced to half of that of men. So the women arose to protest that, and my entire life I have seen my mother and many of her colleagues and friends fighting for women's rights. And I remember cases as young as when I was 7, and I remember a case of another domestic servant who was also the age of 7, who had been burnt with live wires and hot spoons by her employers. So when you grow up knowing the injustices that women and girls are particularly facing, as well as religious minorities, I think it was always for me that I always knew this is what I was going to do because I was always aware of it. And when I was aware of it, I couldn't imagine a life where I couldn't be giving back in some way or helping in some way.
Right. For those who aren't aware, Malia is talking about her mother, Shaila Zia, who was one of the pioneers of women rights in Pakistan. And obviously, if you have grown up with that sort of role model or somebody like that, who you're living with, obviously that is going to have a massive, massive impact on how you see the world in general. So, growing up generally in Pakistan as a law student, what were your experiences?
Well, my experience is always interesting. I think I grew up in Islamabad, as you know, you did, and many of us, and there was a very limited number of law schools that we could go to. So I think that was the very first thing, as well as because most of us did the external degree, which is extremely useful in terms of allowing us to have critical thinking and, amassing that kind of knowledge from a different jurisprudence. But I think where the problem always came in is how do you relate it to the local jurisdiction as well? So that it has its pros and cons, and I think all of us with external degrees came into the legal profession with a much more critical analysis than those who came from at that point in time from the local programs as well. And I think we all had this expectation that we will go into the courts and we're going to, really, be the next Asman Jahangir, we're going to argue our cases, but the reality is very, very different, where Your very initial years, you're just holding briefs, you're taking dates, you're only filing arguments, you're not necessarily conducting the arguments. The Ally McBeals or the Matlocks or the Suits kind of experience that you thought you would go and have this amazing monologue is not true.
Yeah, I
So I
think most
think
most of the people watching would probably have no idea who Ali McBeal was. That was more from our generation. But yes, Suits.
Suits, let's go with Suits, yes.
Yeah.
It's a very harsh reality, but it is also a very good reality to understand the kind of grunt work that is required,
Yeah.
particularly at the early stages of your career. And that's actually where you learn. And I think there's a big distinction between those who just know the law and those who know the process. Because law is mostly process. Litigation and legal practice is mostly process.
So you were, as I mentioned in the introduction, you were one of the people who were behind the Sindh Domestic Violence Act. Am I correct? Which was passed in
Yes.
2013.
Yes, I was one of the people working on it. Yes.
All right. So, and you do have a background in legislative drafting as well. That is something
Yes.
that you have, worked on for quite a while. So, for you, what were the major challenges that you faced or your team faced while you were drafting this bill and while you were lobbying for its passage?
Okay. So I think that the story starts even before that. When I started working, there'd already been about several attempts of passing the domestic violence acts at the federal level. So I'm talking about pre 2010 and the after the devolution process. So initially, Sherry Rahman and Mehnaz Rafi and I believe Riaz Fatiana had already tried to pass the bill at the federal level, and that was never brought forward. And the main issue that kept coming up was that nobody is willing to admit that domestic violence was one, an issue, or two, that it should be a criminal issue.
I'm sorry,
So
what was
when
it before? I'm so sorry. If it wasn't a criminal issue,
it didn't exist. There was no law on domestic violence. Domestic violence as a criminal act did not exist, or even as any act of a violation did not exist. The arguments that we got particularly was that the Pakistan Penal Code already has sections on violence. Why don't we just use those? And the main idea was very simple. When do you have affirmative legislation? When do you have a special legislation? One is when the law does not cover it. For example, you can see all the electronic crimes had to be added later on. You need special
mm,
laws for certain kinds of crimes that came into existence at a later point after the Pakistan Penal Code. But the second reason is when in implementation and in process, a certain kind of violation or crime is being ignored. So the Pakistan Penal Code has the majority of sections which overlap with domestic violence. But what was happening was that when the people used to go to the police station to report a case, they'd say, "नहीं, ये तो खानदानी मामला है. This is between a husband and wife. We can't prosecute on this. We can't file an FIR on this." So within this scenario, and then the second problem was that a lot of the women who are the predominant victims of domestic violence or children did not necessarily want to go for criminal cases under the court as well. Because, this is their husband. Majority of the time, it's someone's related to them or it's someone known to them. And, it's not something acceptable in Pakistani society. So either the implementation side was very difficult because they would not use the Pakistan Penal Code sections to apply to cases of domestic violence. But secondly, they did not have any civil remedies. And thirdly, there were emotional, psychological violence or stalking or controlling of women or their children in a very, very negative manner and was not included in the law. So the domestic violence bill, as it was envisioned, was very, very heavily influenced by the Indian examples and some of the other international examples, but Indian specifically because the dynamic is, of course, very similar. So, for example, domestic violence law at that point was defined to include, of course, all the physical forms of violence, but emotional and psychological violence, where to the point where it would control women. It was understood that domestic relationships was not just a husband and wife, but a joint family system where it could be other members of the family also participating in the domestic violence. So there's one who actually commits the domestic violence, but others can be part and parcel of it. For example, if it's wrongful confinement, the husband may be wrongfully given the order of the wrongful confinement, but other members of the family are participating in making sure that that imprisonment continues. So it's a very specific, nuanced nature of it in Pakistan. So when we first started talking about it, first of all, was to start making people acknowledge that domestic violence does exist. Domestic violence is a form of violation of not just women's rights, but also children's rights and
so
elderly's and
I have
anyone
a
who's
question.
vulnerable.
While you were part of this lobbying process, when you came across people who denied that domestic violence exists in the first place,
Yeah.
How did you convince them?
So it took a very, very long time. So there were many, many people, and I remember lobbying with somebody very senior at one point, and he said, "क्या इसका मतलब है मैं अपने बेटे को थप्पड़ ही मार सकूंगा इसके बाद?" And then explaining to them, okay, and we took facts and figures. We'd say to them, take a fine, okay, maybe you have to realize that the woman who unfortunately may be beaten a little bit may not come to court, but what about the ones who suffer heinous types of crimes?
Yeah.
When we started bringing some of the data and the anecdotal information and saying, the police does not register this case, the police does not register this case. And after a certain while, and it took many, many, many years. So even let's say I started working on this in perhaps 2007, um, but people had been working on this for the last 10 years. So imagine about it was about 10 years before I even started that we'd been trying to talk about it. The first law in Sindh passed in 2013. So even then, it took another 6 years after my graduation and joining of this movement on domestic violence. It took another 6 years for people to at least even pass the bill. And a lot of it was discourse. It was time and time again raising it, raising it, raising it. And I think one of the legislators in Sindh said, now that we talk about it more, the more I see it. That previously it was just things that would happen, but the more you bring attention to it, the more you talk about it, the more you vocalize issues that women and other people are facing, the more I become aware of certain scenarios inside our household or inside our family or inside my constituency at that point.
So a lot of things, as you mentioned, you just kind of take them for granted. You don't really think that it's a
Yeah,
crime per se because it's something that we have sort of been desensitized to for so long, for
exactly.
generations.
Everyone does it. This is
Yeah.
what happens. This is what life
ये
is.
तो
And I
होता
think
है.
that हाँ, ये तो होता ही है. This is how it is, right? And we can even see that if we talk about an intergenerational changes in our attitudes, we see that normally happening an evolution of attitudes with, from our parents to us to our children. But the main thing is, I think, discourse and discussing it and raising it again and again and not being silent about it
Yeah.
and forcing people to see that or want to see and acknowledge is another point. So I think that where we shifted, particularly in Sindh, where it was first, where we shifted from saying no, it does not exist to okay, maybe a little bit exists. Okay, but maybe it's just really bad cases to okay,
Mhm.
let's just, pass the law
Yeah.
now. I think it's time.
Yeah,
So I think Sindh was
finally.
the first one which actually criminalized it and had a specific criminal remedy, followed by Balochistan,
All
which
right.
is back in 2013.
So, right. So now they have criminalized it. There are penal consequences. I believe there's imprisonment, there's fines as well. Am I correct?
Yes.
So, how significantly has this shifted society's attitude towards domestic violence?
Okay, so I think it's very interesting because, sorry, just to also add, so then Punjab also followed suit, but they looked at it from a prevention angle and a response angle, but they didn't criminalize domestic violence. But since then, that law has been passed all over Pakistan in different formats and ways as well, including in Islamabad recently. But I think that looking from the Sindh and Balochistan example, and I think this is the biggest realization, is that everyone expected to see a surge of cases of domestic violence in the courts, but that did not happen immediately. So we went back and we investigated, and what we realized is that what the law did was not necessarily increase cases in court, but what it did was that it allowed women to use that as a threat in their families and their lives. And saying, if you hit me again, I'm going to take you to court because now I have a form of protection. So it had a lot of evidence and a lot of, there was evidence of a lot of dynamics changing at the societal level, at the community level, of women being able to use that as a form of protection, use that as a form of threat against, people who are violent against them. And when it actually started going to court, of course, we're seeing more and more challenges that we see in implementation. And in fact, Sindh is on the verge of passing an amendment to the law to make it more responsive to the on-ground needs and realities that we see.
Okay, that was actually going to be the next question that if you could revise or if you could strengthen the Domestic Violence Act, knowing what you know now and with all the casework that you have been a part of, what changes would you prioritize?
So one is the fact is that the original Domestic Violence Act circumvented the police. So it went straight to a complaint into the magistrate's court.
Okay.
What we realized is that still the police is still the first stop and first entry point to the criminal justice system for the entire society. So we are now proposing in Sindh, and the Women Development Department is taking this forward, is that one is that an FIR can be registered under this, and then there's an entire additional police process on how they investigate cases of domestic violence. The second change that we realized most importantly is the protection order. So under the law that it says that a woman can apply for a civil remedy of a protection order, which is similar to if we look at Hollywood movies, a restraint order to stop
Hmm.
somebody from beating her or committing any other form of domestic violence. Now, when there's a protection order under the domestic violence law, the procedure is still very long. So, whereas women need that protection order immediately, the process still remains longer and it takes a couple of months before a protection order sometimes is implemented. So, what lawyers were doing is that they were actually still applying for a habeas corpus petition under the Constitution or protection under the CPC, but they weren't using the domestic violence one because it wasn't having that immediate kind of relief that was needed. So, we've amended that to say that protection order can be filed immediately if there is any reasonable cause to believe that domestic violence is being committed. So
Okay.
keeping protection order as an interim order. And the third major change that we're requesting is that the protection order and the residence order, which is where you do not allow someone to throw a woman out of the house, which she has a certain claim and right to, is that that should be implemented by the police. Because previously there was a district protection committee which did not form, but also did not have the powers to implement this case. So now we're asking that the police in the local jurisdiction be mandated to oversee and implement this particular law.
Okay. So, all right. So we have the law, we have the implementation, right? We spoke about that. But in a country like ours, where, going to court, as you said in the beginning, it's considered, well, not taboo, but it's something that people don't really want to do, especially women.
Yeah.
How do we sort of, how do we convince people that they should be able to use such legal mechanisms without any stigma or fear attached to it if their lives are truly in danger?
Yeah. I think it's just emphasizing that point. And I think it comes down to two things. And I still say discourse and discussion is still the most powerful tool. Normalizing asking for your rights. Normalize asking for your rights and asking someone to be held accountable for the bad behavior that they have done. Now, it's a very tall ask because it's really disruptive of a person's life as well. So you cannot force anyone to actually go to court, I would say that, but at least they need to know that they have the power to go to court. And even sometimes knowing that they have the power is empowering it's enough itself.
Yeah.
But the second thing is, and I think this is where I would say to the government, is start publishing the number of cases, successful cases, and convictions on the domestic violence, because there has to be some kind of fear or realization of accountability in potential perpetrators or continuing perpetrators acts as well, knowing that there is a chance that they would be punished, knowing there's a chance that they are going to go to jail. But because all we see in the news and all we see in the media, because it's kind of become a sensationalization more to point out where the police or the prosecution or the government is not implementing the act, it's more marketable to mention the negatives than it is marketable to mention the positives. And
That's
if I
true.
put it
Yeah.
that way, there have been convictions, there have been protection orders, there
But we
have been
haven't
resident
really heard
orders.
about them. You're
We
right.
don't
Because
hear about
what
it.
you do hear about is, every instance where, a woman has been tortured, she's been beaten,
Yeah,
she's succumbed to her injuries. And that is what we read about. But
that's news.
yeah, but I haven't
It's
really read about a case where a woman successfully went and, she got a remedy against her husband
we
or her in-laws or anyone
Yeah.
for that matter.
At the Legal Aid Society where I'm working, we have many of those cases, and many other lawyers that we work with. We've successfully used the law in many, many, many cases where a woman has applied for khula. We've successfully gotten cases where a woman hasn't had to return her hak meher because she left because he was beating her. We've had cases, we've had protection orders, we've had convictions. But and it's important to kind of share that news as well
Yeah.
because then you draw power from that as well. And
True.
you
No, that's
drive a
that's
certain
very
kind of,
true because
yeah,
unless
yeah.
I mean once you know that the system is actually working or that it can potentially work for you, that automatically, gives everyone more confidence in speaking up or,
Absolutely.
asking
I
for
mean,
something.
it's still not easy. It's still not easy to go through the court process. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The fact is, there's two things. One, which when a client comes to me or somebody with a case, I will say to them two things. One, this is the law. If you go to court, these are the realities of what you're going to face. Two, this is the law that you can use to kind of mediate and negotiate for what you want. And because the second one is what we see more of.
Hmm.
What we're saying is that, and there's something, there's mediation, and I think Islamabad has a fantastic a mediation center in the High Court as well,
Yeah.
which also does a lot of family mediation as well. And I think it's very important for men to realize that they can be held accountable and that you can be taken to court for this. So it can be used as a negotiation tool as well. Because again, what we say is that law is not always fought in courts. Law is fought prior to that and after that. And the use of law is very empowering when you know you have the law backing you on your side, when the law is on your side.
Very true. And I think apart from, just knowing about the law itself, you were talking about discourse and dialogue. It's also
Yeah,
really important to um, continue these discussions everywhere, not just in
yes,
the academic circles, but actually in circles where people are perhaps not as educated and
yeah,
they don't have access to, as many resources. And वहाँ भी ये बात की जाए that it is not acceptable, it is not okay
yeah.
if you are getting beaten up, if you are getting physically harmed in any way, you must speak out. This isn't something which you have to tolerate. This isn't something जो होता है.
Yeah.
I think that needs to,
That's you have to break that silence, and it's time
yeah.
to be make people uncomfortable. And that's what I
But
keep
that's the
saying.
problem. That's the problem. We don't like being uncomfortable. So when
We
we
don't like
have,
being uncomfortable, but it's time to be uncomfortable.
yeah.
I'm not always the most welcome dinner guest because, when people ask me about my work and they ask me what I do, and I'm just like, no, you need to tell me whether you really want to know or not, because I
No, I
will
mean,
raise
we
all
have,
these
for
issues.
instance, you have the Aurat March and you have everything happening,
Yeah.
and some uncomfortable things were said, they were shared. And,
Absolutely.
that
And I think
created a huge,
domestic violence is particularly difficult because we see a lot of elements of it. And I think, but when I say it's very important to be educated because it's also very easy to be trigger happy and call everything gaslighting and everything
yeah,
violence and
red
everything this as
flag.
well. So everything is a
That's the
red
new
flag,
word,
right?
red flag.
And then there's a question about is this fixable or is this not? Is
Yeah.
it just, because there's also tendency to say, oh, this is a bad guy, he's done this, let's write him off. But the fact is, we need to give men a little bit more chance as well to, because they have learned behavior as well. So
Mhm.
how then do you bring them back and make them realize that this kind of behavior is inappropriate or incorrect? And discourse in casual settings and family settings is very, very important, and to educate yourself on what is or is not violence.
Okay,
And
I'm
and, and
so
I
glad
think,
you
I
said
mean, if
that. That's
yeah,
really helpful because that I mean people who are watching they would want to hear this. How do we address family members or people in our social
oh,
circle who are known to make sexist remarks or who are known to make jokes, at the expense of women or you understand where I'm going with this. How do we
oh
address
yes,
that?
yes.
And sometimes, these are close family members. These are people close to us.
It really depends on a lot of, I mean, I call them out. Honestly, I
I
call
know
them
you
out.
do.
Or,
I know you call them
I
out.
know, but it's very difficult as well sometimes. Is that sometimes, you can call them out as a joke and just be like, oh, oh, look, here we are again. Oh, look, here's Uncle Sexism again. Oh, yes, please tell us your sexist theory one more time. So you can use either through anger or through humor, and it really, really depends on your relationship, who that person is, the hierarchy within the family as well, at what level they are. There's certain people you just have to shut out because you're just like, they're not going to change. They're too old, in certain cases. Or with other people, and I think what people who are misogynistic or sexist get away with is the silence, that the impunity that silence grants them. And I think that even if you stop letting that silence occur, is to say something, that makes a lot of difference after a certain point. And
Yeah.
yes, like we were saying earlier on, that might make things uncomfortable. But you don't always have to fight with them. Sometimes you can just, as I said, just, make a joke about it. And
So
like I said, my favorite tool is
if there's a takeaway from this, it's be more comfortable in making people uncomfortable.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think that is it. That is the main takeaway. Because I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes just, calling someone out in public is sometimes enough for them to feel embarrassed. And maybe doing it two, three times will make them, and they'll get angry. Some of them will get angry and some of them will get
Yeah.
upset. I didn't mean this. I didn't mean this. And you can just say, okay, thanks for clearing that up.
All right.
But, just you have
But
to
call
figure
them
out your
out.
tactic.
Call them
Call
out.
them
Yeah,
out. Call
absolutely.
them out.
Okay. So my last question. What advice would you give young lawyers or law students who want to dedicate their careers to human rights and gender equality work in Pakistan?
Okay, number one, go to court. The one
Okay.
advice that every single person gave me,
Don't
from
run
my
from
mother
court,
to any
basically.
lawyer to anything, you can write as much as you want, you can research as much as you want. you will never understand it until you've actually been to court and taken cases through court. Because everything else makes you a consultant from anywhere else who does not know ground realities. Because until you know the ground realities, until you understand the courtroom, you cannot help the judges understand the situation better. You cannot help the clients. You cannot help society at large because it has to be in a particular context that you have to be speaking in. So even if it's for 6 months, even if it's for a year, even if it's like a couple of cases, go to court because you cannot help anyone until you know the context and what that you're trying to fix.
All right. So, above all, for all the young graduates or soon to be graduates who are watching, make sure that you complete your time in the district courts.
Yes. Uncomfortable, hot, sticky, sweaty, but very important.
Yeah. Okay, that was actually very, very helpful. Okay, this was actually really helpful because again, we have a lot of people who are interested in working for the sector, but like you said, most of them are interested in research and writing and perhaps going for consultancies. But what you've just said that they have to actually go to court, they have to see the ground reality. I haven't heard that advice very often.
No, but I think it's essential because that's the
Yeah.
thing, right? Like even if you're, so for example, a consultancy or a project that I was working on, which talked about improving victim special mechanisms in the courtroom. And you can have all these lovely ones, have separate rooms, have a curtain, have a bench, and then you go into the courtroom and you realize there's no space.
Yeah.
There's
Where
no
are you going
space
to
for
have
it.
a where are you going to have a bench
So
or a curtain?
where are you going to have a bench? So then you're like, okay, all right. And then you have to track down that system. So I remember when we were working on this project, we actually went to every single courtroom and assessed it and came up with localized indigenous things about how can you deal with that. For
Yeah.
example, like you can't have a separate waiting room for survivors in a lot of the courtrooms. So what they did was that they created a curtain. They put a curtained off area, so at least there's no visibility. Or they said the survivor can sit in this room somewhere else until her court case comes up. So there's variations that you have to improvise based on the ground realities. But if you don't know the ground realities, you can't improvise.
Yeah.
So Nida, thank you so much for having me on as well. But I do want to advise everyone that the Legal Aid Society runs a Sindh Legal Advisory Call Center, which is funded by the government of Sindh. So if at any point even lawyers have any clarifications or questions, or if any of their clients need free legal aid, please feel absolutely free to call us at 0800 70806.
That is really helpful to know. And in fact, if there is anything that our students, the SIL Law Clinic, can help as far as research is concerned, please do let us know. We're always there to help.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Maliha. This was really, really helpful. And I'm sure people who are watching and who are interested in working for women empowerment and human rights in general will greatly benefit from this talk. Thanks so much. And we are really looking forward to having you for the seminar, which you have promised at SIL
Yes,
very
yes, yes.
soon
100%.
on your
Absolutely.
next trip.
On my next trip. Thank you so much, Nida.
Thank you so much for everybody who's watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them to us at info@sil.edu.pk and we will try our best to have Maliha answer them as soon as she can. Thank you so much and Allah Hafiz.